Hi guys, welcome to First Rate Photography, where we teach photography and retouching to photographers by photographers. So without further ado, let's start. So right now we'll be teaching you how to work with Camera Raw, how to start with Camera Raw, and how to prepare your image for further post-processing or for exporting. We will be starting by clicking on this link below, which is the workflow options of Camera Raw at the bottom here, as you can see. Clicking it will show you the workflow options, and you will be given multiple options in the color space. I usually use Adobe RGB or ProPhoto RGB for print ads and other color sensitive work, but for social media posting, I usually just use sRGB. In my case, I usually use Adobe RGB because my camera supports Adobe RGB right from the back. And then the color depth defines how many colors per channel um, you will be using. So the more bits per channel, the better. Except that the more bits per channel means the higher the memory usage. So it depends on you. I usually use 16 bits and then convert it to 8 bit later on. But you will see some changes when it comes to gradation and quality. But later on, we will talk about that more. And then image resizing, I usually don't resize my image. I leave it as it is, and even sharpening. Um, open in Photoshop as smart objects. I usually leave this unchecked unless you wanted to edit the raw file more in Camera Raw afterwards. But I'll be teaching you how to prepare your image so that you can edit it in Photoshop without having to go back to Camera Raw later on. So I'll be selecting Adobe RGB 16 bits channel. I'll be leaving it to the default image setting and I'll be pressing OK. So here, as you can see, we have the histogram. Most of you are familiar with it. So these are the shadows, the blacks, the midtones, the whites, and the highlights. So at any time highlights or shadows are clicked, you'll be receiving warnings here at the top. But then again, I will not be talking about that first. What I'll be talking about is how you can adjust your image in Camera Raw to prepare it for Photoshop or for further post-processing. So the concept of post-processing is that you have to enhance your image, but that doesn't mean that you have to rely on post-processing alone. Usually, you have to shoot your image and make it as perfect as you can in camera. So setting that aside, we'll be continuing in discussing this image. I shot this image on a Canon 5D Mark III, which is old by today's standards, and using a Canon 70 to 200 f2.8L lens. Uh, I was shooting at f8 because I wanted to resolve more details. By the way, if you're shooting in like a studio environment with light setup and all of that, I suggest you stop down your aperture, probably f8, f11 even, to make sure that you have all of the details that you can get. Because if you're using your lens at its maximum aperture, in my case at 2.8, while it shows a lot of bokeh in the background, it also dissolves some of the textures on the face of your model. In high-end retouching nowadays, texture is very important. So I would rather shoot in a smaller aperture and make sure all of the details are correct unless I am going to uh, the bokeh effect in a portrait. So with that in mind, let's start retouching or editing this photo to prepare it for retouching. First and foremost, the image is well exposed. However, I would like it to be a little bit more brighter. So I'll be adjusting the exposure just a bit while looking at the histogram here, making sure that none of the highlights are being clipped. As you can see, there's clipping there on the red channel already. So I'll be moving it down by just a bit. There we go. And then the shadows I won't open up so much, because basically, if you're doing a portrait, you want the shadows to be on the face. You just want them on the right side of the face, which part you want the shadows to be. But you don't have to remove them. Removing shadows on a portrait removes the depth perception. So I would rather leave the shadows there. The whites are okay, everything is okay. And then probably I'll be adjusting the white balance by a bit, because I don't know if you guys can see it, but for me, it's a little bit too warm. So let me introduce you to the tools in Camera Raw here. So we have the hand tool, the zoom tool, which are pretty self-explanatory. But we have here the white balance tool. So it actually picks a certain point in your image and compares it to the image, and then tries to find the correct white balance on it. So the way you use this is that you don't just press on anything. As you can see here, there are RGB channels. So find the point where the RGB channels are closest to each other. You should also find a neutral or a grayish tone, just to make sure that the tint isn't affected as much. So in this case, it's pretty well balanced actually. But let me find a better one. Probably this part. And as you can see, it adjusted the temperature and the tint ever so slightly. So let me do that again. I'm gonna reset it. As you can see, the picture is a bit warm. And I'm gonna find that point where it's very neutral. And there you go. The yellow color cast that I'm seeing is already gone. And the image itself is fairly okay in terms of the color. We're gonna be zooming at 100%, and I'm gonna show you the details that I'm talking about earlier when I was telling you guys not to shoot at a wide open aperture. So you can see the details from here. And this is ISO 200, by the way. Yeah, it's ISO 200. So you can see most of the details on the skin, which we can correct later in Photoshop. So that's the white balance tool. So I'm going back to the main preview of my camera raw file. And there's always this crop tool, which is again self-explanatory. Straighten tool, which I use a lot. And then there's this spot removal tool. Uh, well, it's good enough, like removing spots like these pimples, and you know trying to feather it and size it. But then again, it only works for a while. It's it's an entirely different world in the Photoshop healing or skin correcting techniques, but it does the job just fine. Except that sometimes it also fails a lot because it's trying to. Well, I think personally the algorithm is different than what they use in Photoshop, so I usually don't use that. I don't mess around with it. There's a red eye reduction tool, which is pretty much basic from this terms on. And then this I would like to discuss the adjustment brush tool. So what the adjustment brush does is that it allows you to adjust a certain part of the image that you brushed in. So the way it works is that, like, if I want to uh, get rid of the shadow, or probably at least lighten it up, just paint on it, and then you can adjust pretty much the exposure, the shadows and the highlights, and it depends on how you painted it or how you masked it, but you will see that uh, it works pretty well. But I would rather do it in Photoshop, as I said. You can also use it to dodge and burn, which I seldom do. Like if I want to dodge this part of the nose and then increase the highlights, as you can see. And then if I want to burn this part of the nose to make a nose bridge, then and so on and so forth. I'm just showing this to you guys just to give you a grasp on how you can uh, adjust the image using the adjustment brush in Photoshop. I seldom use this, but it works wonders if you don't want to go into Photoshop and dive into it. There's also this gradient filter tool, which is basically the same as the brush tool, just that in this case, it creates a gradient mask instead of the brush that you just created. So to show you guys that, I'm gonna increase the temperature here and probably adjust the gradient here. So it's basically applying these adjustments to the gradient mask that you just created. There's also this radial adjustment filter, which is basically the same gradient mask, just that from a linear gradient, it becomes a radial gradient. This is especially useful if you're trying to light up a subject in an environment where the face wasn't lit up properly, but the overall exposure is okay. I'll show you an example of those images later. But for the meanwhile, let's move on. So I'm gonna go back to my hand tool here to return to the basic adjustment layers here. And then there's always this tone curve. I seldom use this tone curve adjustment, but it works just like the curve in Photoshop where you can add contrast like that with the S curve, or you can go to each channel and tone your picture and make it more interesting. uh, Probably like create your own Instagram filter using the curves. So it works like it works very similar to the curves adjustment layer in Photoshop. uh, just that in this case you're working in Camera Raw. So with that in mind, I actually don't want to tone my image right now. So I'm just gonna remove the point that I made by dragging the point back, or just putting 255 and 255 in the input and output values. 0 and 0 in red, blue, green, RGB 0. Okay. And then we can go to the details panel where Photoshop, where Camera rather applies sharpening. So I'm gonna show you a little technique that I learned through the years about this. Well, first and foremost, when I edit pictures and I know that I'll be doing uh, high-end retouching on them, I usually zero everything out here. Zero sharpening and zero noise reduction, because I would like to do that in Photoshop where I can control everything properly. In here, it does everything in a global scale, as opposed to Photoshop where I can mask it out and apply it in parts of the image that I want. So here we go. I can apply sharpening, so I'm just gonna flip my image. So what is you can see, or maybe zoom it to 100% and near the eyes, so you can see the adjustments that are going. So moving the amount of sharpening, of course, sharpens the image. It in fact creates micro contrast between the highlights and the shadows to give the illusion of sharpening. And then the radius, of course, adjusts how sharp or how big the radius of the sharpening would be. So When I'm sharpening, I usually keep it in a low level because I don't want to over sharpen my image. I can always sharpen later on, but I would just love to have that control of adjusting the sharpening later on instead of doing it right now, because sharpening an image right now will also sharpen unnecessary details like this blemish over here and these lines under the eyes that I want to remove in post later. So I usually seldom sharpen, but I'm gonna show you a technique that I learned through the years in order for you to sharpen without the image looking over sharpened and with the skin texture looking as natural as it can. So at first you have to adjust the sharpening, probably around, yeah, 45 is okay, and then the radius I think around 0.8 is okay. So as you can see, the image is really sharp right now, and then you can adjust the details here. So the micro details are being sharpened as well, but I don't want to mess around with that because I want the skin to stay smooth. And then there's this masking adjustment. So what I do here is I press the Alt key or the Option key on your Mac, and then drag the masking slider. So the black parts of the image are not sharpened, or the sharpening is not applied to the black parts of the image. Rather, it's applied only on the white parts. So I can choose to sharpen only the eyes, and barely 80 or 90% of the skin is unaffected. Or I can adjust it by a bit like this so that the pores are sharpened by a bit. So you can always do that and release it. And as you can see, the skin is barely affected, but the details on the eyes and the mouth and the teeth are still there. You can prove this theory by pulling the sharpening up by a lot. So as you can see, only the eyes are being sharpened and the mouth here. And the rest of the skin is not affected unless I pull down the mask, and as you can see, the skin is starting to show more details, but of course it's starting to show the skin blemishes as well. So I'm gonna return that to 0 first because I don't want apply the sharpening. And then I also don't want to apply noise reduction right now. Noise reduction will be a entirely separate discussion because it dives into a lot of details. So we will not be discussing that right now. We will be discussing, however, the basics of how you prepare your image. So let's just recall for a while that in the basics panel, I just adjusted the exposure ever so slightly and adjusted the white balance to remove any color cast that is on the image. So I'll be discussing this HSL and grayscale panel next time, as well as the split toning. So for now, I'll be going to lens correction. I'm gonna be zooming out the image, and I'm gonna select, well, if you're shooting wide open, like f2.8, f1.8, f1.4, there are always gonna be chromatic aberrations. Chromatic aberrations are the green and purple fringes at the sides or at the edges of your image, which is less visible here because we were shooting at a stop down aperture. But you will see them in high contrast areas like this one. As you can see, there's green color fringing here. So remove chromatic aberrations basically removes those, as you can see here. If I check that, it will remove those chromatic aberrations there. It's always a good thing to remove these chromatic aberrations, especially if you're not using top of the line lenses, which tend to produce more chromatic aberration than high end lenses. And then this is a subjective part, the enable lens profile corrections, because some of us wants the distortion that the lens introduced in the image, but some of us want it to be as real as possible. So if you enable profile corrections, Adobe Camera Raw will detect your lens profile and apply the lens profile correction that it has on its database to your image. So usually, like in this case, I shot at 200 millimeter because I wanted the distortion of the face to, you know, compress the face a little bit. So I'm just gonna remove that distortion correction and I'm gonna put it back to zero. So you can see here from 100, that's the normal, or that's the corrected image already. But if I pull back the distortion, as you can see, the face of the model becomes smaller, which is in my case I purposely did. And then there's vignetting. Vignetting is the darkening of the corners of the image, as you can see here, where, well, every almost every lens suffer from vignetting. However, it's also a personal choice. Some people want vignetting because it focuses the the subject more because of the darkened corners. It naturally guides the eye to the middle of the picture. But as I said earlier, I'll be preparing this to post processing. So I'll be removing all the vignetting here and leaving the chromatic aberration on. And then we can go to manual if you know you wanted, like in this case it's too dark, so I can adjust the vignetting more to basically remove all of the dark corners. Effects is a different animal. It's usually usable in landscapes, like especially this dehaze and the grain. If you add, if you want to add vignetting as well, so you can always use this. But I seldom use it, so I'll leave you guys up to it. And then there's the camera calibration process. Uh, I usually shoot in a neutral profile like this one, but I found that Adobe Standard renders better skin tone than the neutral or the portrait or the faithful color profiles on my camera. So I usually leave it at Adobe Standard. It's a personal preference, so you guys can do whatever you want. Go to camera faithful and let the color rendition of your camera do whatever. But I'm going to Adobe Standard all the time. And then there's always the case of presets, which I personally don't like using. Basically, because I want my image to have the feel that I want it to have, instead of having a preset that applies a certain amount of color corrections and color grading to my image, which sometimes fails, sometimes works. But if I were you guys, I will try to understand colors first before diving into presets, because if you understand colors and how they work, then you can adjust the preset later on to fit your image. Otherwise, I am suggesting that you guys get away from presets first. Try to do everything on your own so you have a better and in-depth understanding of how it works. And then there's snapshots. So what happens in snapshots is that it basically creates a history for you of your image editing, so you can go back there later on. So I find it not that useful, but many photographers find it useful. It's just that my workflow just starts with Camera Raw or Lightroom just to do the basic correction like exposure compensation, removal of the, well, adjusting of the white balance and so forth. But I don't usually stay in Lightroom or Camera Raw that much, so I usually leave it as it is. So from there, as you can see, my image has been uh, corrected already, albeit there's like a little amount of correction that I did. So that sums up everything about it. Usually, I open up for I open up the image in Photoshop, as you can see here, and then I will be working on this later on to fix the skin flaws and basically, uh, well, the makeup is good, but there will always be flaws like the lip shape and then the contouring. Sometimes it changes because of the light. Sometimes the blending is not enough, so it's up to the retoucher to do that. But hey, that's about it when we prepare images for post processing. And I hope you guys learned something. You can comment below um, if you have like questions or comments on how I work through. Uh, you can always subscribe to this channel and please click on the notification bell and turn notifications on if you want to be notified whenever I upload new videos. Um, After this, I'll be posting another lesson wherein I'll be editing this picture uh, using frequency separation and Dutch and burn and all of those stuff. And then very soon I'll be interviewing photographers on how they work, and then we'll be showing you their techniques and their workflow. So I hope you guys stay tuned and till next time.